Right, so greetings everyone. Hello. So we're here to launch a new series of lectures in the village of Avebury, the Avebury Druid Lectures, which we hope will be an annual thing from here on after. This is going to take place around the summer solstice each year. We're slightly after the 30th of June in 2023, which is an auspicious time. And we're here in the old chapel in the centre of Avebury village, which I used to use back in the 1990s to hold full moon peace meditations. So I know this area very well. And the vicar of this chapel, the minister he called himself, was a dear friend of mine called Reverend Burt, whose surname I can't quite remember, but he's no longer with us. So we'll start with just a moment's silence in honour of all the parishioners who've been here for 200 years. It's now run by the National Trust, but it was a spiritual sanctuary place. So let's honour their memory with just a moment's silence. Thank you. So, okay, so just by way of introduction, really, I'm going to start with a little bit about my work and background for those that don't know. So I'm technically the Peace Druid of Britain and founded the European Druid Council when I moved to France in 2017. So I'm over from France, especially for this lecture, and also the marriage of my youngest daughter in Cambridge. And I'm the Archdruid and founder of the Order of Peace Poets, Bards and Druids, which is one of the members of the Council of British Druid Orders. It's COBTO. And I've been involved with that since 1998 as the peace officer. And I'm also a member of the Druids Order of Avebury, which is one of the Druid groups here in and around Avebury. Not all members live in Avebury, but we respect and venerate this ancient landscape, which is quite, wide, including also the Stonehenge landscape, which is part of it. It's a heritage UNESCO site, Stonehenge and Avebury. The people that built this were the Wessex culture from the ancient Bronze Age. And it marks the kind of shift between the Bronze Age culture and the Neolithic peoples that introduced farming to this part of Wessex. I've had a long love affair with this landscape since actually the early 70s. I studied philosophy at the University of Bristol back in the early 70s. My father was dying, so my brother and I ended up driving past from Devon to back to Brighton, and we passed Silbury Hill, and we thought, what's that? So we got out. I'd never heard of it, really. And that began a sort of fascination with the people that lived here and their spiritual teachings, because I was studying philosophy and religious studies and metaphysics, and I started my studies of Buddhism at that time and yoga. And I realised these Druids, I was reading a book by Anne Ross called Pagan Celtic Britain at the time. And I realised these Druids were actually the Buddhist equivalents in Britain. They were like the yogis of this landscape. And because I believe in indigenous prioritisation, if you want, I thought, well, that's interesting. Why didn't I learn about them in school? And that began a lifelong learning about the ancient Druids of these islands. And I realised they were, really important. Since then, of course, I spent a study time in Canada reading the source texts of different religions, and then came back to Britain. And in fact, one of the first weekends after I landed here, I ended up sleeping in Avebury in the ditch, just because I felt at home. It was like I'd come back from Canada and North America because I didn't quite feel at home. I felt this was Indian land, and I felt I would come back and be with my indigenous roots more. And then, of course, I went and studied at the University of London, did actually a history degree, specialising in intellectual history. And then I worked at the University of London, setting up a Peace Studies Institute from about 88, 89 onwards. And the thing that interested me about the Druids, as we'll see, is that they were sworn to peacemaking, non-violence. They were not warlike. And that was why I realised they're the equivalent to the yogis. You can't study yoga in India and be warlike and violent. And you couldn't study with a Druid in the same way. So, after I graduated, I then worked at the University of London to set up this Peace Institute. And I was doing my own research towards a PhD at the time on interfaith mediation. Because I realised the world is falling apart with all these interreligious wars and conflicts. And I thought, shouldn't we be able to find a common thread running through them all? And surely for that, the pagan traditions are important, the indigenous traditions of Latin America or Central Asia or Europe or North America and so on. So they often were the voices of peace and sanity, I realised, particularly in the ecological world that we're now struggling to create. So in 2007, I was given this Druid peace sword of Britain here at Avebury in a ceremony just behind us in what we call the sun circle. And it has the words for peace on the blade in many different languages. And I thought that was very symbolic because the story that I knew and was told about in Ireland when I went to visit Ireland, I went to the Fellowship of Isis headquarters and I met the founders of the Fellowship of Isis, bringing back the ancient goddess traditions from Egypt, but also eclectically. And they had a Druid order there as well. Reverend Durden Robertson and I, got on really well. And he told me, Thomas, do you know anything about the history of ancient Druid Ireland? Have you learned anything in school? I said, well, no, not really, but it's amazing. He told me to read one book by Geoffrey Keating, and I'd never heard of him. And I went back and got it. It is the sacred history of ancient Ireland told from a very learned Catholic scholar in the 1600s who went around all the abbeys and monasteries of ancient Ireland where they still had medieval manuscripts telling the ancient history of Ireland from a Druid perspective. And it tells the stories of all the different Druid deities that we now know about, Lugh and all the different gods, the Dagda and so on, and the goddesses. And he put it into a chronological order, as if these were historical events. And it was the first and ever real attempt to write a history of ancient Ireland. He's called the Herodotus of Ireland. Now, I'd never heard of him, but and it's sad because when Cromwell's army invaded Ireland, they destroyed a lot of these monasteries and their libraries because they were Catholic. And he himself was killed at the altar of one of his parish churches by a Cromwellian soldier. It's like a symbolic moment of the destruction of the ancient Christian wisdom, which was harmonious with the pagan, and its replacement by a sort of fanatical, puritanical, fire and sword kind of version of Christianity that then did imperialism and capitalism and took over indigenous lands all over the planet in the name of progress, and often slaughtered their indigenous priests. And they started this in Ireland. Anyway, this was all a revelation when I went to Ireland. I was in my early 20s. And I was thinking, this is interesting. I never knew this. And so one of the stories Geoffrey Keating tells is the story of the founding of the Druids. And it's as follows. So there was this ancient wisdom teacher called Phineas Farsaith, who was from Scythia, which is a sort of anywhere between the Black Sea and Central Asia. It's a sort of not a specific location, Scythia. And he and his sort of group, relatives, family, friends, and all that, were travelling through the plain of Shinar at the time when the Tower of Babel was being built. And he saw this Tower of Babel going up, and he said, there's going to be trouble. He foresaw the trouble. And so he founded a language school to preserve the knowledge of the original language of humanity from before Babel, because of course we all know the legend that Babel, man's arrogance and hubris, tried to rise to challenge the gods, and In fact, it led to chaos and confusion, and nobody could understand each other's language anymore. But Phineas Falset foresaw that, and so founded this school, language school, to preserve the original language. Now that's in keeping. It's a legend, but like all great myths, it tells the truth. It tells the truth, and that language school was the foundation of Druidry. That was the beginning of the Druid craft. And it's to preserve that ancient knowledge, which is the knowledge of the unity of mankind and our unity with the divine. So that, and then the story goes on, Phineas Falset, then his son, Gael, moved through Egypt, fell in love with the Pharaoh's daughter. Their descendants all went on to Spain and eventually went to Ireland by ship. And that's why we call them the Gaels. And Gaelic is the language they spoke. And, Emergin was the Druid chief who led the landing on the shores of Ireland from that perspective. So when I was given this Druid sword with all the words for peace in all different languages, I immediately thought, that's a sign. That's the original language. The original language is peace. But we've forgotten it. And that's what the Druid mission is to revive that, to hand it on, to pass it on. So anyway, I set up the International Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy in '91 at the University of London, which is unique among peace studies institutes. It studies comparative philosophy and religion and peacemaking. So it's like interfaith reconciliation. And I've been active in mediations and so on in conflict zones since then. And I've also been a member of the, I founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Stonehenge. And that was around the time I was doing the full moon meetings here in the 90s. We founded the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Stonehenge in, I think, '98. Me and a chap called George Fursoff, who's no longer with us, who'd been in the Battle of Bloomfield, where these pagans and people that wanted to go to Stonehenge for the summer solstice have been roughed up by the police horrendously and arrested, and, like all abusive powers, they blame the victims for causing the trouble. So we had 30 so meetings, 33 or whatever meetings, in and around Wiltshire, in Stonehenge and roundabout, ever since. It's still going. I published a book about it. And we set up together the peace stewards at the summer solstice celebrations at Stonehenge every year, which is still going. And I served as a volunteer there many years running, and took my daughter, and we've had fun there. And we try to make sure that it doesn't become violent, because some of the travel community and the police, they don't really get on. So it's sort of making sure it's a mellow experience for everyone. And more recently, I've suggested to the powers that be that the pagan community, broadly defined, Druid, shaman, Wiccan, whatever you want to define yourself, goddess people, should collaborate to create a spiritual pilgrimage centre for Stonehenge and Avebury, somewhere in this landscape. And a lot of it's owned by the MOD. So I've suggested the MOD should give us, for a peppercorn rent, for 999 years, like, a hectare or two, where we could build a roundhouse out of wood, staff it, each coven, each grove could take a week, and 52 groups all over Britain and Ireland could then come and man this thing. And there might be a skeleton staff that are there, there'd be a bookshop. And unlike the kind of current facilities at Stonehenge and Avebury, there's nowhere to really stay and learn the legends, and meet the wisdom keepers. If we had an actual site, a pilgrimage centre, then it would be great. It would build its own stories and legends. It would have a fire pit, it would have food facilities, and people could stay there for 3 days or whatever. And the knowledge keepers would come. And by having different groups coming from different parts of Britain and Ireland and Europe, maybe, different traditions would be shared, a living centre. Anyway, that's a live project. And since then, I'm also a member of the Wisdom Keepers Council, which meets once a month. And I've written the first encyclopedia of Druid studies. So that was quite an epic work. It took a couple of years. And I think it's worth doing because I think the indigenous traditions of this part of the world, they're also important. We all love the indigenous traditions of North America, Australia and New Zealand and so on. They're profound, but what about the ones here? They're also important. And I ended up, by chance, teaching religious studies and philosophy at a school called St Mary's in Caen, which is just the neighbouring town. It's a beautiful Anglican girls' school, sort of mini Eton for girls. And I had great fun teaching there, the whole gamut of philosophy and religion. And devised the periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies when I was there. And at Poole Grammar School, I was head of religious studies and philosophy for 2 years there. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm bringing to this talk. That's by way of introduction. I was given the Mount Hemus Award in 2008 by the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, OBOD, run by my friend Philip Cargon, and had to give a lecture in Salisbury. But there's no lectures here in Avebury, and I think that's, there's nothing in Stonehenge. So this is an attempt to combine academic work with the Druid community and say, look, let's attend to this. Because there's no way you can do Druid studies in any university in the world. There's no master's degree you can do in Druid studies. It doesn't exist, so I've created this discipline. And that's what this lecture series is for. Each year we'll invite a prominent Druid scholar. And people are beginning to wake up to it. Like in North America, indigenous American Indian studies is quite a big thing now. There's centres in at least 10 universities you can do higher degrees in it. Well, let's have some Druid studies in Europe. And since I moved to France, I've been meeting quite a lot of interesting French Celtic experts who are looking at Druidry and stuff. I'll come to that in a minute. So that's by way of introduction, really. Little pause. So the first thing I want to ask is, what do we know, therefore, about the mysterious philosophy of Druidry? What was it? Firstly, a word about the term Druid. Where does it come from? I've studied the etymology of this in depth, and it comes from, Pliny and others said, in the Latin linguists, they said it came from the knower of the oak. Druid was the Celtic word for the oak in Gaelic and Welsh and Gaelic, which was the language of Gaul and France. It does have that meaning, but it's even more than that, because Druid means that which truly endures, that which is eternal. And if you look at the etymology of Druid, it means the same root as the word Dharma in Buddhism and Hinduism. The Dharma is the eternal truth that endures beyond time and space and life after life. Buddhists say the Buddha's body is gone, but the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body, lives on. The body that taught eternal truth, that turned the wheel of Dharma, that is immortal and never dies. It will outlive this planet and this solar system. So someone that can see or know that Dharma is a Druid. The Druid is the eternal truth, the Dharma, and the vid is to see or know, as in videre in Latin, or idea in Greek. To see, to have an idea of something, is to know it. So the seer of the truth is the Druid. That's quite profound. When I learned that, I thought, blimey, why didn't nobody tell me this? This is like we had our own yogic seers and sages. Yes, we did. And that's the term in all the Celtic languages, like Breton, Brittonic, Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, and Gaelic in Ireland, and so on, and France. And we know that this was the language, these were the people that built these ancient stone circles. All the archaeological evidence points to that now. Colin Renfrew and colleagues have corrected the 19th century idea that the Druids came in later with the Iron Age, 800 BC, and that there was something else here first. No. There were successive technological waves coming in. There was bronze and then iron and other things. But the people that brought farming to Britain and Western Europe were speaking a form of proto-Celtic languages, undoubtedly. And Colin Renfrew reckons their sort of home world was in Anatolia. According to my colleague Brian Murarescu, who's just written a brilliant book called The Key to Immortality, he reckons they were masters at brewing psychedelic beer, and that was part of their culture. And they found evidence that this is true in sort of archaeochemistry. These people knew how to brew beer that was unbelievably potent, and gave them a glimpse of the afterlife. So those are the people that came and brought farming and built these amazing stone circles of the Wessex culture and further afield. There are about 1,300 stone circles in Britain and Ireland and France alone. There are others in Spain, Galicia, 1,300. And this one we're in now is the biggest of them all. It's like the mega temple. So that's the people we're honouring. And their seers, these Druids, had this training which took 20 years at least. It had different specialisms. Once you learn the Dharma, once you learn to see the truth, to know it, you could then apply that knowledge in healing, medicine, herbs, or history, the legends, the stories, or law, doing justice, making peace between warring tribes. As diplomats, Druids would travel all over Western Europe from tribe to tribe, bringing peace, it's much more intelligent to make peace rather than fight. And that's what we're talking about. And I call, anyway, that mysterious philosophy, I think is worth investigating, seeing what we can learn about it. Okay, how are we going to do that? What is Druid Studies? My talk is called Druid Studies, Ethics and Peace, a new old academic discipline to speak truth to power with. So what is Druid Studies, Well, it's about finding out what we can about the beliefs and cosmology of these ancient peoples from various sources. We can go to archaeology, and there's a huge of Celtic archaeology and British archaeology. They've done lots of work. We can look at graves, and we can look at burial customs, we can look at jewellery, we can look at art, and designs and so on. We can also look at anthropology, so people that are similar in their tribal customs. We can look at, for instance, Indonesia or Malaysia or Africa and say, that's kind of what they used to do at Avebury. Or, we can make extrapolations from the anthropological literature, and people are beginning to do that. Obviously, there's thousands of books written about the Celts and about Druidry from different perspectives, and I think I've read most of them. And they're in, all of them shed some light on this, and they come from their own perspective. So there's a huge literature in Irish, in Welsh. There's a big literature in France, I've discovered, which the British Druids, on the whole, don't know anything about. I happen to speak French, and I live in France, so I've been able to access it. And they've been looking into the Druids of France and Gaul intensely since the time of the Revolution. It's a little known fact that at the time of the French Revolution in the 1790s, a lot of the people who were saying we need to rethink France were either Freemasons or Druids, and often both. And Thomas Paine, who spent time in France during the Revolution, was a radical Democrat. He wrote a paper arguing that the Druids were here first. Freemasonry was a later development from Druidry. He was a friend of William Blake, who we Druids regard as a Druid bard in his own right. You can imagine Paine and Blake talking about these things 200 years ago, along with Nicholas Bonneville, who was Thomas Paine's great friend in Paris, and was a Freemason, a Druid, a seer. they were talking about rebuilding the world anew and getting it back to how it used to be in the old egalitarian days. And so they did things like, when they got a new constitution and everything, they renamed all the parts of France after the chief river of France. That's a very Druidical thing. Like, instead of calling it Sussex or Norfolk or whatever, they renamed it after the river. So you'd have Thames, you'd have Severn. And in France, all the regions are named after rivers, which is entirely Druidical. And they brought in a new calendar. The months and days were named after plants and herbs and trees and key animals. So, you know, that's a bit of a hint. The French were interested in getting back to their Druid roots. And they also brought in what they call the Liberty Tree. So every village in France had a tree around which the villagers would dance with ribbons and celebrate the rebirth of equality. Did Napoleon know all this? Yes, he certainly did, because he was himself a Freemason and a very wise man, a mathematician, which is why he went on pilgrimage, effectively, to Egypt and began the study of Egyptology in France. He took with him, this is unusual for a military invasion, he took with him 800 scientists, scholars and academics who translated and took pictures by hand of all the great hieroglyphs, and you know, and then when he came back to France, Champollion, who was a Freemason and a savant, translated the hieroglyphs into French, you know, and we could access the ancient wisdom of Egypt once again. And this became a big thing in France, and so the French Gallic Druids realised, well, we're as old as, you know, the Egyptians, and we go back that far. And they founded a lodge of Freemasons in Paris, the Lodge of Isis, which to join you had to be an actor or a musician, you know. And they also founded the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which again you had to be a savant. And Thomas Jefferson was a member, Jeremy Bentham in London, all the great intellectuals of the Enlightenment were members of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, which is the Nine Muses. And a lot of them are writing, rediscovering Druidry. The secretary of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters was an amazing man whose father was a pastor in Switzerland, and he ended up in Paris, and he was the secretary, corresponding secretary of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, who wrote this book, 9 volumes, called, it's in French, never been translated, called The Comparison of the Ancient World with the Modern World. And Antoine Cour de Gébelin was his name. And he dedicated it to the Queen of France 2 years before the Revolution. He kept publishing it, you know, even after the Revolution. And it's a really detailed study of all of ancient history, Gaul, the Celts, the Druid era, and then modernity. You know, which is best? Who's wiser? You know, and it should be translated into English, and it never has. And Benjamin Franklin was the Grand Master of that lodge, by the way. So you can imagine they were talking Druid stuff in the cafes of Paris all this time. And they were doing it in Britain too, because you know, we were not far behind. For one thing, scholars at Cambridge and Oxford and Dublin and so on, we realised we have all these medieval manuscripts in our libraries. My daughter's doing a PhD at Cambridge, you know, it's to die for, Cambridge Library. And when they tragically shut the monasteries at Glastonbury and elsewhere, fortunately, some of the manuscripts were saved and parked in the universities. Not all the manuscripts, and there was terrible carnage and you know, in Ireland and so on, but some were saved and went to Oxford and Cambridge and other universities. And now we have a chance to go through these medieval manuscripts and look out the Druid, you know, information in them. Nobody's done that. I'm really the first person that's saying we need to do this. And in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, I've sort of made a start. But this is a huge work that needs to be done. We can also look to philosophy, the history of philosophy, including classical philosophy, because there are classical accounts in Aristotle and other classical authors of the Druids, because the Greeks honoured the Celts. They were their near neighbours, just north of, the Mediterranean region. We know that Posidonius, a great Stoic philosopher, travelled in Gaul deliberately to sit and learn from the Druids. He was a learned philosopher, one of the most wise of all the ancient world. He was from, the island of Rhodes. And Pompey, who led the Republican cause against Caesar, was not a fool himself. Pompey, when he was in Rhodes, he made guards stand outside Posidonius' home to protect him. And they had to lower their thing in respect when he came out. So anyway, Posidonius went and spent years travelling and meeting Druids. We've lost the manuscript. It went up in the flames of Alexandria. But I still hold dear that it's in some lost library in Snowdonia. We will find the lost manuscript of Posidonius, or it could be in Gaul, somewhere near me. But we do have references in Aristotle, who knew about the Druids and respected them. We have references in many other classical authors. And some of my colleagues have gone through. John Matthews, who's a great scholar of this stuff, has done anthologies of Druid writings and put all these classical things together. Lucian, who was a satirist later after Christ and a humorist, he gives the Druids a humorous role. He makes out they were sort of magicians who could conjure up witches, and they got into trouble because of this. So he always spins it like a comic thing. But they give us precious information about the beliefs of the Druids. One thing we know absolutely certainly is they believed in reincarnation. The soul is immortal. It lives as a human life, and then, depending on what it does, it has another life, and it progresses each time. The favourite pattern of the Celts and the Druids is the spiral. The spiral is the symbol, the metaphysical symbol of their philosophy. We all are on this spiral somewhere. And, we all make progress on our spiritual journeys. And we're meant to help each other. The Druid was a teacher and a counsellor to help the youngsters, to help people who've got a bit lost. And then there's oral teachings that have come down. I've met ancient, older Druids who told me stuff, and other people alive now. There is an oral tradition also that lives on in Ireland and Wales particularly, but also in Britain and Scotland, and that's precious. And we need people to go out and do PhDs interviewing the last Druids that are still part of that oral tradition. It's still there, and it's in the west coast of Ireland or the Highlands and so on. It's precious. And I think that, to sum up, and I've mused about this for many years, I sum up if somebody said, you've got 10 seconds, tell me what was the metaphysics of the Druids, 10 seconds max, I'd say, and this came to me in a dream once, I sum it up as paradoxical simultaneity. For the Druids, all worlds are interlinked, interwoven. I could be speaking this talk here, and simultaneously across the world, someone's doing something similar, and we're interconnected by a divine energy field, and somebody else is doing something else. And this is paradoxical simultaneity. And we see it in our lives when we have moments of synchronicity. You meet a long-lost friend you haven't seen for years, or you discover somebody that is on your wavelength, and how's that possible? They've just suddenly appeared, Those are examples of paradoxical simultaneity. Now, the way this works, according to Druids, is that the three worlds, the underworld, Anu, it's got different names, this world, and the divine world, which is called Kugant, the sort of blessed world, these three worlds intersect. And so the divine world, which is full of gods and goddesses, that can interweave with ours. They can send down rains of grace. They can cause the synchronicities. They want to bring lovers together from across the world, they will. And they might even appear. We might have a god or goddess walk into this